I would like to thank everybody for coming along today, including our younger generation down here that's represented. That's terrific. I think the level of participation in the audience here is indicative of the level of interest in sea level rise issues, particularly here in Eurobodalla, but you're not alone. I think the issue of sea level rise itself, how to plan for it and how to deal with it's become quite politically and socially divisive, not just here in the Eurobodalla, but all up and down the New South Wales east coast and indeed around the country. And I think the majority of that is driven by uncertainty, and underpinning that, at one end of the spectrum you've got people that simply misunderstand the nature of the science and the physical coastal processes, and indeed we've got two fantastic presentations from Ed Carrell and John Church that delve into the science of those sorts of things. At the other end we've got almost blind ignorance of the issue, and people simply saying, I don't want to know about it, I don't want to understand it, but we've all got to deal with the implications of that. And also people don't understand the context within which councils have to operate in order to manage these issues. As Carl rightfully pointed out, we've dumped an enormous amount of responsibility at the doorstep of local government, and as a state government entity we're no different. We've all piled in as well. And issues concerning sea level rise and strategic planning are largely those at the coalface of councils. So this is an incredibly difficult thing to deal with, not only trying to grapple with the science, but you need to appreciate that councils have to operate within certain frameworks that are imposed by the state government, whether it's legislation, policies, other sorts of instruments like that. They also have legal advisors sitting off there to the side, and indeed they have insurance underwriters as well, all of which are looking at the decisions that council make in the short and the long term. So it's a very, very difficult juggling act. But these sorts of forums, we don't do enough of them, are certainly an important staging point. And you've got some terrific experts here today in their respective fields, but it's a real coup for Eurobodalla Council to be able to acquire the services of John Church here today. Without really wanting to single anybody out, I think it's rightful that I do. I mean, for the better part of the last 2 decades, John's been the key international expert with regard to the understanding and the science of sea level rise. So it's a real coup to have that person here in the room today to be able to talk to you all about what's become quite a divisive issue. But from my perspective, whilst we're going to drill down into the detail of some of the science and try and unpick some of the myths for you, I'm going to actually zoom back out and provide a little bit of a backdrop, if you like, for the framework within which councils have to deal with, and how as a state government we've set up a framework to try and manage the issue of sea level rise as broadly one of the elements of coastal zone management that we have to grapple with. And they include things like beach erosion, long-term shoreline recession, tidal inundation. Sea level rise is just another one of those uncertain physical processes that we deal with, and we've been dealing with that since 1990 in a risk-based framework, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. I'll also touch on the New South Wales Sea Level Rise Policy Statement. That is no longer, but it would not be an appropriate forum not to raise the Sea Level Rise Policy Statement and the reasons why it ultimately is no longer with us. The Minister for the Environment sought advice prior to the abolition of that statement in 2012 by the Chief Scientist, and I'll also touch on the findings of the Chief Scientist as well. And then I'll touch on Stage 1 and Stage 2 coastal reforms that have been ongoing for the last couple of years, and again just add to the complexity or the onion rings that are sitting around coastal zone issues and sea level rise that the government are grappling with. So if we turn our attention to the Coastal Zone Management Framework in New South Wales, it's actually one of the most revered and sophisticated and integrated frameworks that exists anywhere in the world, and indeed has been copied by many other jurisdictions, at least in part. We have a range of head legislation, the Coastal Protection Act, Local Government Act, EPNA Act and the Crown Lands Act. There are others, and they set the guidelines around different parameters and aspects of coastal zone management. But in particular, the Coastal Protection Act, that's administered by the Minister for the Environment, requires to have coastal zone management plans certified in accordance with the provisions of the Act. And there's guidelines and everything that fit underneath that we'll get to. There's a coastal protection regulation specifically that deals with regulating development in the offshore marine waters of the state. A range of policies, the New South Wales Coastal Policy of 1997, the Coastal Protection CEP 71 and CEP Infrastructure from 2007, all of those have, and when I just use the acronym CEP, that stands for State Environmental Planning Policy. So these are all rules and regulations that are established by the state government that councils simply have to operate within in order to be able to do their strategic planning and development assessment around these issues. There are guidelines that have been in place prepared by New South Wales Planning and OEH, and ones that go back before that. As I said, to 1990, the New South Wales Government released a landmark manual called the Coastline Management Manual, which established back in 1990 a risk-based management framework for dealing with all manner of coastal hazards. And one of those is sea level rise, and that's embedded within the appendices to the manual. And we've actually been incorporating the issue of sea level rise from 1990 onwards. So we've been doing that for detailed design purposes in New South Wales, for hazard definition purposes, all sorts of coastal planning matters for the better part of a quarter of a century now. So it's not something that's new to us. There are lots of ways of being able to deal with the issue of and the uncertainty of sea level rise, and indeed all of the other coastal process hazards as well that we're dealing with and have been dealing with for many, many decades. There is a rather interesting, almost little throwaway in there called S733. That's an indemnity clause under the Local Government Act, and it's there specifically. We're the only jurisdiction in the country that has this. It's a good faith indemnity provision for councils that act in accordance with the respective manuals that have been gazetted by the government for doing floodplain management studies and also for doing coastal studies as well. The original Coastline Management Manual was the process advocated by the government that was gazetted. That's now been replaced by a guideline for preparing coastal zone management plans. And broadly, if councils act in accordance with the process advocated in those respective guidelines and manuals, they're indemnified from actions that arise in the floodplain and the coastal arena. Now, those particular provisions are looking at being copied and replicated in all of the other state jurisdictions in Australia. And that's a very, very powerful clause to try and protect councils who are looking at a myriad of decision-making processes in and around floodplain management and coastal management. Any one of those could bankrupt a council into the future. So long as councils act in accordance with those provisions in those respective manuals, they're indemnified. And that's been upheld by the High Court of Australia as well. There's grant funding programs from the Office of Environment and Heritage. We provide 50-50 funding for councils for floodplain management issues, for estuary management issues and coastal management issues, for both the preparation of all of the studies and the implementation of any physical works that may come out of that as well. There's technical advice from OEH as well. We have lots of technical advice available in each of the regions to assist councils to go through these processes. And of course we also collect and manage data, which is done under contract through Manly Hydraulics Laboratory, and Ed Carrell will be talking specifically around some of the things that we've learned from the collection of the Ocean Water Level Recording Network in New South Wales, but we collect other data as well, such as offshore wave data and things like that, that everybody gets on websites and utilises, but all of that's part of the integrated framework of coastal zone management in New South Wales. It's all funded by the state government. So that just gives you a bit of an indication that we're not dealing with isolated issues. There's quite a diverse fabric of issues, a complex integration of legislation and policies, regulation, monitoring and technical advice that's been going on now, as I said, that started back in 1990 to deal with these sorts of issues. Some of the key clauses, I guess, of interest. There's not a lot that you can find in any legislation anywhere in the country that deals with sea level rise, but specifically under the Coastal Protection Act, one of the objectives to encourage and promote plans and strategies for adaptation in response to coastal climate change impacts, including projected sea level rise. Now, our Minister cannot approve a coastal zone management plan that does not address the objectives of the Act, and that's one of the key objectives of the Act. The guidelines for preparing coastal zone management plans have minimum requirements in there, and of course they're the ones that give effect to the 733 indemnity. And one of the key elements in there in the minimum requirements is a coastal zone management plan which addresses coastal risk, should include projected climate change impacts on risks from coastal hazards. So no matter whether people don't believe in climate change or sea level rise or any of these sorts of things, there's no way out for a council. They must consider it, and it has to be there, and it's embodied within all the legislation and the requirements that are gazetted by the government. So if we have a look at the New South Wales Sea Level Rise Policy Statement that was introduced in September of 2009 and lasted a whole 3 years. That's what it looked like. It was abolished in September 2012. And of course, a lot of people have become fixated or had during the period that the policy statement was operational, become fixated on what were perceived as government mandated benchmarks for sea level rise that included 40 centimetres to 2050 and 90 centimetres to 2100. That was possibly the undoing of the policy statement. Certainly in hindsight, those of us that were involved in the development never ever anticipated that those sorts of things would ever be called benchmarks. That inferred an undue level of certainty that was never intended from those very broad course estimates over those planning horizons. They were intended to be used for sensitivity testing purposes, and over time they become emboldened within a policy and they were called benchmarks. And the reality is that they were misconstrued, they were implemented different ways by different councils, and in the end the government really had no choice but to try and remove that, and they did, obviously. There are a range of things that were within that policy statement that were not particular to setting of benchmarks, and they were the sort of things that you would advocate in any sort of risk-based management of an issue that's got enormous uncertainty around it. And I won't run through those. I mean, you can look at those at your leisure, but obviously continuing to provide emergency management support to coastal communities during times of flood and storms. They're things that were ancillary to the policy statement. They were a whole of government policy statement. The whole thing was removed, and I'm pretty sure that some of the politicians that were involved in the removal of the policy statement really didn't understand the complexity and the detail of some of the other matters that were embedded within the policy statement. But nonetheless, I mean, as a matter of a duty of care, we still perform those roles in any case, but there was a lot more to the policy statement than just the undue fixation on those particular planning benchmarks. Prior to the policy statement being removed, in April of 2012, the Minister for the Environment sought advice from the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer about the adequacy of the policy statement and the science underpinning the government's policy position at the time. And it's a pretty extensive report. The terms of reference were quite loose, and it gave the Chief Scientist and Engineer a fair bit of latitude to report back to the Minister on anything that the Chief Scientist thought was of interest and relevant to the debate concerning policy around sea level rise. But nonetheless, the key finding in the covering letter back to the Minister was that particular statement on the right, but I'd like to draw your attention really just to the bit that's highlighted, and that was that the way the science has been used to determine benchmarks is adequate given the current level of knowledge. So, I mean, that's a take-home message, irrespective of a lot of the politics surrounding first the introduction and then the abolition of the policy statement. The reality was that the science underpinning the intention of the policy was still adequate. And for anybody that's interested, I mean, look, by all means will be available afterwards, and I can provide you with details of all of these resources as well. So don't feel you've got to pick it all up now. You can read all of these things at your leisure, should you so choose. And the last bit that I'd like to cover, I guess from a government perspective, that's been ongoing for the last couple of years, and I know some of you people in the room have been involved in attending the public forums that we've had during the consultation of various rounds and iterations of coastal reforms, is just to touch on the status of both the Stage 1 and the Stage 2 coastal reforms, which are ongoing at the moment. Key elements of the Stage 1 reforms were the abolition of the policy statement in 2009, amendments to the Coastal Protection Act regarding temporary coastal protection works on beaches in hotspot locations, guidelines to be prepared by New South Wales Planning trying to clarify issues pertaining to the sea level rise notations on 149 certificates, and indeed New South Wales Planning over the last couple of months have had elements of that out on public exhibition. Other initiatives were to develop a coastal hazard mapping guide that's under development in consultation with the expert panel as part of the Stage 2 reforms. A business case for an independent coastal advice centre. That's something that emanated from the advice back to the Minister from the Chief Scientist, and that has been deferred and pushed over into Stage 2 reforms. The Minister announcing that she would defer certification of coastal zone management plans until the Stage 2 reforms were finalised, because one of the key elements of the Stage 2 reforms was to try and introduce new tools to make it easier to implement coastal zone management plans. Fact sheets on the roles of the SES and councils during erosion events, that's been completed and available on the SES and most councils' websites. And a coastal ministerial task force and an expert panel sitting to the side of them developing Stage 2 coastal reforms. So, I mean, obviously it's a little bit chaotic inside government at the moment, because the whole of the ministerial coastal task force that was there 2 weeks ago are no longer there, none of them. So it's going to have to be re-energised and come up to speed, and may change the focus of the Stage 2 coastal reforms heading forward. However, in the broad context, the Stage 2 reforms are going to integrate coastal erosion management with local government and planning reforms that are currently underway at the moment, and that's never been done before. It's often been seen that we've got a land use planning system going in one direction, councils preparing coastal zone management plans going in another direction. Well, they're all going to be brought together under the new planning system. Improve coastal hazard notations on 149 planning certificates as well, and that includes the work that New South Wales Planning are doing on the sea level rise notations. Improve support to implement and fund coastal zone management plans. The government's mindful that some of the very big capital works that have been proposed in key hazard locations on the open coast that may run into the tens of millions of dollars are simply unaffordable with the conventional funding models that we have available. So Deloitte's have been engaged to provide advice back to government on looking at new and improved funding models and other issues that will be developed in consultation with the expert panel. And for those interested, they can go back to the press release that was issued earlier this year on the 30th of January jointly by Ministers Parker, Hazzard and Page, that outlined these sorts of things in the direction of the Stage 2 coastal reform. So I hope that provides you with a little bit of a backdrop on some of the somewhat peripheral but also related issues about how we deal with sea level rise within the broad gamut of coastal zone management issues. Thank you.